Does conservatism have any answers at all to this debate between the universal and the particular in politics? Check it out.
A liberalism, on the one hand, whether it's left liberalism or right liberalism, it's really ultimately a universal system. The particular doesn't really matter. All countries can have the same constitution. And then on the other hand, a kind of Schmittian postmodernism radicalizes particularism. There's no universal truth at all. So everything is simply friend or enemy. He looks like he's political because he raises the nation so high, but he chops off that connection to the universal that actually makes the particular political community meaningful. And I think conservatism mediates between the universal and the particular, and it avoids both of those extremes that are so endemic to our time.
Concepts with Sean Whatley.
Welcome to Concepts. My name is Sean Whatley, and today we have Jeremy Geddert back with us. He's an associate professor of political science at Assumption University in Massachusetts. He's born in Saskatchewan, but is now living in the States. He's an author, he's a speaker, and he's most recently, or at least last year, he was a sought-after expert on George Grant. He's written a number of book chapters and articles. Today we talked about an article that he has coming out called Liberty Without Liberalism, and that's in Without Diminishment. So by the time you're seeing this episode or listening to it, that article will already be out. He solved a problem for me that I've been wrestling with all year, and much beyond that is this tension between the universal and the particular. So just to recap, one of the core pillars of liberalism is this idea of universalism. Universalism just simply means that what is true everywhere around the world at all times in all places. So if we think liberal democracy is a true and good thing, it's an ideal way for people to organize themselves, universalism will lead us to go bomb another country, Iraq, shall we say, or Afghanistan, and try to set up democratic elections. So a liberal democracy, and we expect that things are going to turn out well. And of course they don't. So there's this tension with universalism. Now we know that human dignity is a universal truth. We should treat people as though they have inherent human dignity. So how do we deal with the tension between universal truths, universalism, and particularity? The acknowledgement that some places are the way they are because of the history that a particular people has. Professor Geddert was the first person, for me anyways, to bridge this gap by saying conservatism mediates between the universal and the particular. So I got really, really excited about that. Anyways, we had a long discussion and we talked about everything from where we're at right now in Canada. How did we get to where we're at? Can government be neutral? Talked about the political technology, and we don't need to cultivate virtue anymore. We just need people who are experts at running the technology of politics. We talked about Nietzscheanism and the worry that we have that people will just say we need to have someone with power and control to sort out our country. And so that's an ongoing worry for us. Anyways, fascinating discussion. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Don't forget to click like and subscribe. And also, if you're able to, become a Patreon member. I could use any support you're able to offer there. Let's get on with the show. Jeremy Geddert, welcome back.
Thanks, Sean. Great to be back.
Yeah, I appreciate you making the time. We were having so much fun in the green room before we started. I almost forgot to hit record, but anyways, we've been batting back and forth. Super funny. I sent a list of questions and then you sent a list of questions. And one of the questions that I really liked on the list, I said, oh, you got to ask this question. You said, well, that was your question.
So, you're getting good at this, Sean.
No, that's scary. That's a sense of memory lapse there. But I wanted to set up our first set of questions. You have deep experience on both sides of the border, Canada and the United States. You've spent a lot of time studying George Grant. You've written about George Grant. You have a piece that by the time this airs will already be out and without diminishment, called Liberty Without Liberalism. So just in a very broad way, I wonder if you could tell us why perhaps Canada actually offers a better critique of liberalism than some of the best critiques of liberalism that we've seen published in the United States.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. It's a great question, something that I love talking about. I'm not sure how much my American audience loves hearing me, but why does Canada have a better critique of liberalism? The short and slightly simplified answer is that America was born in liberalism, and Canada was born in a reaction against American liberalism. So in the 1770s, the 13 colonies are British colonies. They think of themselves as British, but that allegiance is starting to weaken. People throughout the colonies are reading John Locke, who is very clearly a liberal. And then in 1776, Thomas Paine, who is a radical, publishes his book Common Sense, which in a country of about 500,000 households, or 13 colonies, I should say, sells about 500,000 copies. And within 6 months, America declares independence, as Paine had called for. Well, obviously, there are plenty of people in the 13 colonies, particularly in the northern colonies, who say, well, look, we're British, and when we're unhappy with what our government is doing, we don't go and shoot at the police. And so we're not up for revolution. We're conservatives. We're anti-revolutionary. We are loyal to king and country. Now, obviously, the Loyalists ultimately lost the battle in the 13 colonies. So in 1783, with the Treaty of Paris, these Loyalists, who have lost everything in America, they're dispossessed of their properties. They move northward to what George Grant calls the cold and forbidding regions. What Jacques Cartier had earlier called the land God gave to Cain. They moved for an idea, and that idea was loyalty. That idea was gratitude to their inheritance. And those are deeply conservative impulses. Now, at this point, you don't really have a lot of English population in what we would now call English Canada. So Britain, of course, Royal Proclamation, 1763, has taken the territory from France. But at this point, most of the population is French. And so you don't have a colony with British government and critical mass of British people until the Loyalists come to Canada. But they're not simply coming for economic reasons. They're coming for an idea. And because of that, they give a particular national sense to what would become Canada. They're there in a distinct reaction against American liberalism. And so I would argue that a critique of liberalism is, in a sense, baked into the Canadian DNA.
Yeah, great answer. So I liked when you started saying ideas. The notes I was writing, you said they thought that loyalty to God and country was a good thing, and they had loyalty to that idea, loyalty to the king, loyalty to their religious beliefs. They were grateful for that. However, were they basically aligned with the other presuppositions of the people in America? And I'm thinking specifically about what they thought about humans. Did Americans and Canadians at that time both assume that humans were fallen and faulty, and because of that they needed to be grateful for what they'd inherited and cautious? Or were they more landing on the side of, you mentioned Locke and Paine, and I'm thinking of Rousseau, were they more landing on the side of thinking, well, humans are really a blank slate and you can be whatever you want to be? and there are no limitations to human potential. So I didn't warn you that I would ask this question, but you've mentioned ideas, and so I'm wondering, was there a fundamental difference in their philosophy, their presuppositions, or was it just about how they were going to live that philosophy out? So the Canadians agreed with the Americans, but we also want to live in loyalty to the crown. Or did their loyalty to the crown stem from actually a different set of basic presuppositions? Or is it impossible to know? So there, I've asked you 3 questions, and you don't even have to answer the question. Go ahead.
So the original colonists in the 13 colonies, particularly in the northern and mid-Atlantic colonies, were deeply Christian. And because they were deeply Christian, they could not have this, purely sunny, optimistic, progressive view of human nature. They were deeply charged with the sense of human sin. But most of the leaders of the loyalists in the 13 colonies were Anglican clergymen. They were not Puritans. They were not Calvinists. They didn't take a total depravity approach to human nature. So they understood the reality of human sin, and they recognized that they needed God's grace. But they also didn't have the purely dark vision of human nature, that our nature was completely fallen and that we could do nothing apart from God's grace. And so in this sense, they had an important understanding of the natural realm, something that was consistent with, say, what Thomas Aquinas had come up with in the Middle Ages, the sort of synthesis of natural Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology. And Richard Hooker, whom I've written about, was one of the crucial transmitters of this tradition into Britain. So you get this kind of halfways that is aware of the natural realm, that is able to reason using philosophy, that's able to speak to a secular world, but also appreciates that there's something beyond that. And so that, I think, insulates the loyalists from much of what was going on in the mid to late 1700s, which is the era of the Enlightenment. A lot of the Christians, and particularly the high church Christians, the Anglicans and some Lutherans, left for Canada after the Treaty of Paris, 1783. At the time of the Constitution in the now United States, I guess it would become the United States once the Constitution was passed, only 12% of people in the 13 colonies were members of a church. And so much of what you get in the American Constitution, and there's lots of good things in the American Constitution, but there's no question that it is shaped by a kind of Enlightenment liberalism. And so that is something that Canada, I think, was born in opposition to that really optimistic Enlightenment understanding of the human person. And it always had a deep Christian understanding of the sense of sin that is always present in the human heart.
So just to be clear again, so Enlightenment liberalism, I often think of that as an emphasis on reason. We could say reason, progress, science, downplaying the aspects of revelation, certainly religion, tradition, God, king, country, all of that. That seems to fit. It's almost a paradox. It fits with a Calvinist understanding that because we're so sinful, everything that we've inherited is probably rotten and no good anyways. But it also fits with what you said about Anglicanism, saying that, well, we're fallen, but we also have some aspect of our ability to reason there. So it seems to take a bit of both. Or how am I confusing that? Can we just lump the Enlightenment into either side of the Calvinist Anglican dichotomy, or is that oversimplifying things?
Peter Augustine Lawler is a great Catholic thinker, and he argues that the sort of extreme total depravity Calvinism on the one hand of the American founders And then the extreme Enlightenment liberalism of we can have this new political technology that can solve our problem gets into this kind of accidental compromise that kind of ends up in the traditional Catholic Anglican approach. I think it's too good to be true, because I think the people who didn't have some kind of implicit compromise between extremes, but those who actually had a vision of the human person in a harmony of reason and revelation, those who were following from Thomas Aquinas and Richard Hooker, were those in Canada. French Canada particularly following from Thomas Aquinas, and English Canada from Richard Hooker. And so I think Canada has this classical and Christian synthesis baked into it, where the United States basically went to the extremes and hoped that having the extremes fighting against each other would somehow kind of work out in practice.
Brilliant. No, I haven't heard that put so well. That's very helpful. Now, you mentioned political technology, and I'm just reading a book right now by Kenneth Minogue, The Liberal Mind from 1963. And he makes the comment in there that one of the presuppositions of liberalism is that politics is really just an effort at, I think he says it's a technical practice, but I want to say technocracy because George Grant was big on technocracy. I wonder if you could dilate a little bit more. You said political technology, and just expand on that, and then maybe share your thoughts on whether or not you think that's basically the presupposition we're seeing on how government should function today within a liberal mindset.
Yeah. So Wilson Carey McWilliams, who taught political philosophy at Rutgers for a long time, he was a teacher of Patrick Deneen, the well-known post-liberal. He kind of introduced, at least to my knowledge, the term political technology. And I think it's a really nice shorthand for explaining political modernity. This idea that we don't need to cultivate virtue anymore. You know, this is what the classical political thinkers, Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas, said. They said you're not going to get good politics if you don't have virtue. And you're never going to have perfect virtue, which is why you can never expect perfection in politics, perfection in this life. Well, modernity says that we have modern science. We've got the scientific method, and that is the only way to determine knowledge. So all of this wisdom from the past, well, who's to say what wisdom is? You know, we all disagree about what wisdom is, but we can believe in science. If you can measure it in a lab, then that's real knowledge. And it's real knowledge that can be applied. And we've all seen, obviously, in the realm of the physical world, you know, we've seen what applied science can do. It can do some really amazing things. And even a critic of modernity like George Grant could acknowledge some of the amazing things that medical science has done. But the problem is that modernity says we can do that in politics. Thomas Hobbes, the first modern political thinker, he calls himself the inventor of political science, and I think he really was the inventor of modern political science. He thinks we can solve the problem basically through applied mathematics, through political technology. And this is where I take this phrase from. The idea that politics is about technical problems, and if you get the right kind of solutions, then it doesn't matter what kind of people you have. You don't have to cultivate virtue in the people, and you can even kind of override what they want to do, because they don't even really need to believe in it. You don't need to convince them of the wisdom or the justice of this. You just need to show them the political technology, and they'll be wowed by it, just like we are all wowed by modern science.
Yeah, love that. Man, you can apply that in so many ways to what's going on right now. So as soon as you mentioned the word modernity, though, I have to ask you just to give your sense of what you mean by that word. And while you're answering that, the thought came to mind that it sounds like you're talking about Strauss's first wave of modernity. Now, we don't have to go into Leo Strauss's three waves. We can if you want. We don't have to if you don't want to. But I couldn't resist mentioning it because it came up in our email exchange as well. So it sounds to me, I loved your answer about political technology and political science. And I'm wondering if you could give us your definition of modernity and whether or not the way you used it just now is more in the sense of Machiavelli moving forward. We'll just get on with the practical work of running government. Who cares about asking metaphysical questions? Or are you thinking of modernity more in a Justin Trudeau modern kind of sense? So unpack that word modernity, and which wave of modernity are you talking about?
Well, if you want a quick definition, I'll say modernity is a rejection of final causality. But
I love it. I love it.
We should probably explain it in a little bit more intelligible terms. And I'm not talking about Justin Trudeau. I'm talking about the 1640s. Thomas Hobbes and Leviathan, which comes out in 1651, the founder of political modernity, and Francis Bacon's A New Atlantis, 1612, the advent, I would say, of modern technology, and René Descartes' Discourse on Method, 1637, the beginnings of modern philosophy. So modernity, I would say, is a rejection of the classical understanding of philosophic wisdom. And more specifically, it's a rejection of the philosophic understanding of nature, which is to say that every kind of thing, including human beings, has a particular kind of what Aristotle called a telos, a distinctive practice that makes that thing that thing. When we classify different species in zoology, how do we know what's different from one species to another? Well, there's some kind of distinctive there. Aristotle looks at the human being, the human animal. What makes the human animal different? Well, he says we are rational and political animals. These are things that other animals cannot do. Well, modernity rejects this idea because it involves first principles and it involves metaphysical questions about what the nature of the human being is. There'd been a lot of conflict in Europe over the previous 100 years. And the story that was emerging in the 1640s, the Treaty of Westphalia at the end of the 30 Years' War, the birth of the modern nation-state system, is that we're not going to do politics by reference to first principles because it's going to tear us apart. For instance, if you ask the question, what is a woman? Well, that's something that can arouse considerable controversy, right? So we're not going to talk about that question. Modernity is going to say that not only are we going to not talk about it, but we can't really get answers to that because that's talking about metaphysics, that's talking about the nature of the human person. What we can do instead is we can measure things in a laboratory. And anybody can measure things in a laboratory. We teach the scientific method to high schoolers. And so, Francis Bacon said that even men of no great genius can come up with new scientific discoveries. And so what this means is that we don't need the old hierarchy. We don't need the old authorities. And we certainly don't need tradition. Because if we're accepting something on the basis of tradition, well, it's not really knowledge because we haven't established it for ourselves from the ground up. Descartes starts off by saying that I'm not going to assume anything. Okay, what can I discover? He says, well, I think, therefore I am. His famous sort of first phrase. So the idea here in modernity, I would say, is that nature is not a standard or a guide or a limit for us. It's not a moral obligation that we are born into. It's not an obligation that we inherit. Rather, modernity says that nature is all that stuff out there. You look outside the window, you see green things. That's nature. Nature doesn't give us purposes. Rather, we give purposes to nature. Nature is just material. We take it and we use it as we want for our own self-chosen purposes.
Yeah, love it. And as you were talking, I thought, you mentioned about peace and trying to avoid conflict, and so we'll avoid metaphysical questions. And I couldn't help but wondering, well, wait a second here, Professor Geddert, you're sounding a little bit like Fukuyama and saying liberalism was our great savior that came along and helped us have peace and unity because we didn't have to war over silly religious issues. I don't think you think that. I'm trying to wreck a straw man, but I want to give you the opportunity to correct that potential misunderstanding. And then also to maybe answer whether this appeal to peace, so we're going to avoid talking about metaphysics because we'll just get on with the more peaceful work of running government. I'm wondering whether that isn't an excuse, because the idea that we're not going to talk about metaphysics, as I understand it, can go all the way back to Lucretius, right? Who said we're just a bunch of atoms. The physical philosophy, a physical materialistic philosophy, metaphysical naturalism, is actually very old. It's as old as the Greeks. And so I often wonder whether that wasn't just waiting in the background to reassert itself, and the excuse of peace was the opportunity for them to say, okay, now let's get back to our senses. We're now going to follow Lucretius and be atomists and all the rest. So I've asked you a couple things there. Number one, are you just following Fukuyama and saying the reason everything changed is because we were fighting so much and therefore we needed to abandon metaphysics? That's the first part. And the second part is, have you ever wondered whether or not we were just seeing a reawakening of a materialism that was actually very ancient? And they finally had the opportunity to say, see, this is a better solution. So any thoughts on those two issues?
Yeah, Sean, boy, there aren't a lot of people who talk about Lucretius, and you've probably actually brought up the best possible argument against Hobbes as this brilliant trailblazer. Some people have argued that Lucretius is Hobbes before Hobbes. That's a really interesting question, and I think there's something there, but I don't think Lucretius quite has this idea of modern science that Hobbes has. Hobbes is a personal secretary to Francis Bacon, and Hobbes also spent some time in Paris when René Descartes was there at the same time. So I think Lucretius gives some antecedents to Hobbes and some important ones, but I do think Hobbes is doing something new. So as for the question about Fukuyama, it seems to me like Fukuyama thinks that you can only have liberty if you have liberalism. And that's precisely what I'm trying to argue against. Because I think Britain had liberty for centuries before it had liberalism. And this, I think, is part of the Canadian-British inheritance. Starting with the Magna Carta and developing slowly and gradually throughout the centuries, you have a history of checks and balances in British government. You have a history of limitation on power. But this doesn't come from a sort of U.S. Constitution kind of approach. It comes from the recognition that with great power comes great responsibility. And so there's always this kind of back and forth between Parliament and the king. And even in the 1660s, after the interregnum, Britain realizes, oh, hey, when we got rid of the king and just ruled with Parliament, actually, we didn't really know what we were doing as Parliament. We needed a check on our own power. And so just as the kings had healthily devolved power to lower levels of government and lower levels of society, and Richard Hooker, incidentally, gives the theory for that, So Parliament recognized, hey, we need some limits on our power as well. And so in this sense, the British people have been developing liberty for many, many centuries before you get liberty conceived as an ism. Any kind of system that ends in an ism is something that you need to exercise a little bit of skepticism about, because it's usually taking some value and turning it into an absolute. Traditional classical British liberty, I would argue, was a value that was understood within a constellation of values. It was a very important political value, but liberty was given to people inasmuch as they had demonstrated that they could exercise it responsibly. The king devolves power to a judge to hear cases because the judge knows the whole history of British and Roman law so much better than the king does. The king doesn't run your farm. The Lord does, because he's done this for generations. The king doesn't raise your kids because you can raise your kids better than the king can. And so there's different levels of liberty that are devolved to the level that can best exercise responsibility. That, I would argue, is very different from the modern Enlightenment system of liberalism, which turns liberty into an absolute value that always and everywhere must trump every other value.
Yeah. And you bring that out. I just love your piece, Liberty Without Liberalism. Again, when we're recording this, it's not out yet. So I should refer to it in the present tense, because once this airs, your piece will already have been out for a couple of weeks. And in there, you mention Magna Carta, and you'll know these way better than me. I as far as I know, there's Bill of Rights, Petition of Rights, habeas corpus, private property. There's a whole bunch of things in there that we look at now as being essential elements, pillars, principles to undergird a free society, a society that values liberty. And yet all of these predate the writers that we often identify as the founders of liberalism. But even just now, as you were talking, I love how you laid it out. You said the king is happy to delegate this aspect to the courts and et cetera. And it seemed like the presupposition of your whole argument, probably due to space constraints, was through the lens of thinking of this as the efficient aspect of the English Constitution. How do we get things done? We can get things done better if we delegate this to the courts. You can manage your family and your farm better than the lord of your district can. So therefore, it's most efficient when we're thinking of trying to accomplish things that you do it. And yet, I couldn't help thinking about Walter Bagehot's The English Constitution. Famously, he talks about the efficient and the dignified aspects of the Constitution and how the king really represents, at least today, perhaps. Now, maybe you were referring to a couple hundred years before Bagehot. Bagehot was writing at the end of the 19th century. But Bagehot famously said that we need the crown and the monarchy to uphold the dignified aspects, the aspects of the Constitution that we can't put into writing and points and propositions, but it gives us something to love and to identify with. So I'm wondering if you had more space in this essay, beautiful, beautiful essay, loved it. Would you maybe have said that I've described really the efficient aspects of the Constitution, but don't forget, there's also the dignified and there's other elements. And the reason I ask that, well, sorry, I'm talking too much here, but the reason I ask that is because I see that as, at least in part, a component of the motivation for people to say, we have no love for our country. We just seem to be running our country like a technocracy. And we bring people in if it helps the GDP, and we add more laws if we think we can run it more efficiently. But no one's talking about actually a love for your country and actually thinking that our national holidays are pretty cool and Christmas is a great season to celebrate, and we've done it for hundreds of years. So more the dignified aspect of the Constitution. So I've talked long enough now that hopefully you've had a chance to formulate a answer in your mind. Were you emphasizing the efficient aspects of the Constitution, or have I misread you?
Yeah, no, Badgett gives a nice framework there, and I use that when I teach modern states. And there's nothing wrong per se with efficiency. I mean, one of the watchwords of 1867 of the British North America Act is peace, order, and good government. And I think sometimes people on the right are a little bit too critical of government. George Grant talked about how government, at least when it's doing its job properly, can actually help to build up the nation. But I think you've identified there that the link between the efficient and the dignified has totally been severed. Because these days, our efficient class is ashamed of our history, ashamed of our inheritance, ashamed of the idea of tradition, because they've been largely captured by a kind of progressivism that obviously clearly dominates our academy. And so I think they're taking this modern science approach of, oh, well, we're just being neutral because we wouldn't want to impose our beliefs on anybody, because that's sort of what the dignified function does. It stands for something particular, something personal, something that is our inheritance. But anything that is particular is going to be particular to us. Well, is that kind of exclusionary? That doesn't seem very nice. It doesn't seem very welcoming. It doesn't seem very tolerant. So let's not talk about those kinds of things. Let's just make Canada the most efficient country in the world. Well, the question is, what purposes are you putting that efficiency to? I mean, this is one of the big questions that Strauss asks in the second chapter of Natural Right and History. He says we're building a society that has all sorts of technical knowledge, and we're incredibly fortunate that these people who don't believe that you can reason about first things happen to believe in human decency and treating people well, even though they don't have any kind of philosophical background for that. And so, yeah, I think we've very much lost that. But maybe getting to the other part of your question, I think we've forgotten that the efficient part in the very long run can't even be efficient if we don't have the dignified functions. Because liberalism wants to claim that it is neutral, and technocrats want to claim that, well, we're just delivering the public policy that the people have requested and doing it in this kind of neutral fashion. But they take for granted our whole inheritance, the fact that we can work together as a society because we have shared norms, we have a shared inheritance, we have a shared, I don't want to say social contract, but cultural expectations where we will sacrifice our own immediate impulses for the common good because everyone else also will in that same kind of way, in a way that is unspoken, a way that doesn't have to be articulated. And when we forget about those kinds of things, when we start to say that, oh, Canada is a post-national state, we start to undermine the level of trust that is necessary even for a supposedly neutral liberal society. And I think it's really telling that after Francis Fukuyama wrote The End of History and the Last Man and said, liberalism is spreading around the world, it's the final Hegelian form of government, one of the next books that he wrote was called Trust. Because he came to realize that at the very least it cannot be the universal form of government if the people within that particular society don't have trust in each other.
Yeah. I loved how you said the efficient presupposes a strong, dignified And that is, yeah, that's a beautiful way of saying. So maybe you can answer this for me. Post-liberalism is a point of discussion. Now, some people say maybe we've even gone beyond post-liberalism. We are post-liberalism. Even I'm thinking of Milbank, I think, said that. He said, "Oh, that's old news. We were discussing that back in the early 2000s." And John Gray also, he was writing about this, in the 1990s. And so all of these, we're a couple decades behind these thought leaders. Having said that, post-liberalism is still a thing, I think, that people like to talk about. And it seems like there's two ways to think about this. So your essay addresses that. You're saying, no, there's liberty actually without liberalism. So we're not saying we don't want to completely get rid of liberty. And when we're critiquing liberalism, I often take the approach to say that, and I want you to agree with me or tell me why this is wrong, but I often say that liberalism was great in many ways. I think Kenneth Minogue's term for it, he said it opposed dictatorial kingship and religious intolerance. So at the time, it did solve some problems that we were suffering from. However, it presupposed a very thick sense of culture. So the dignified aspect was very real in our lives. Because liberalism is so good at tearing down oppressive structures, it also tends to tear down everything in its wake, and it risks leaving us with nothing. It leaves in its wake nothing that carries involuntary obligations. So liberalism really doesn't like anything that includes the involuntary. If it's voluntary, great, we can support it. But family, faith, tradition, dignified elements of the Constitution, no, that's way too much involuntariness. And so we need to challenge that. It seems to me that we can attack liberalism itself and say that it is wrong, root and branch. And sometimes it seems like Deneen lands more on that side. Or we can say that liberalism is failing because those dignified elements or a thick social structure has failed. Now, maybe it's a chicken and the egg, and we say, well, liberalism caused that. Well, maybe we rotted from within, too. So then, is liberalism failing? Or are we seeing failure, frustration, decline as a result of our own failing? So are we as members of society the reason for the struggles we're seeing around us now?
Yeah, Sean, that's a great question. And some people who want to defend liberalism in a broader, more capacious kind of sense are going to say that liberalism can succeed if it has the right kinds of people in it, if it has virtuous people using that kind of liberty. That's the best argument I think that you can make for liberalism, and I respect people who make that argument. But I guess my question would be, does liberalism itself tend to undermine the pre-liberal foundations that make liberalism work? Again, I would bring it back to the classic British approach to liberty, where you can have liberty, but liberty is not an absolute value. You're given liberty. Liberty is devolved to you inasmuch as you've demonstrated the capacity to exercise it responsibly. This was what the pre-modern tradition of liberty had in Britain. And this is what gets undermined, I think, by the three waves of modernity, as Strauss puts it. So in the first wave, you get Thomas Hobbes, who says that liberty is the absolute. There's nothing above liberty. We can't say what wisdom is. So society is going to try to be completely neutral. We're not going to talk about any preconditions for liberty. Then the second wave comes along with people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who say, well, this society isn't providing any meaning to me because it's simply talking about, my self-interests and I can use my liberty, but what's the point? This isn't satisfying me. But Rousseau does not take up this broader sense of nature that the pre-modern understanding of liberty had. And so what he does is he looks inside himself. He says, I need to be authentic to myself because that's how I'm going to get meaning in life. And what this means then is that the government has to endorse what I find when I look inside myself, because the market out there, people are using their liberty to establish what's going to be out there in culture. And I'm kind of on the outside because I'm being true to myself. I'm a free spirit, like Rousseau himself was. And so the government needs to endorse me and endorse everyone else's authenticity. This is how I'm going to overcome my alienation, to use a word that Karl Marx would take up in a big kind of way. Well, then we get to what Strauss calls the third wave of modernity, what I would call the first wave of postmodernity. And this is in Friedrich Nietzsche, who says, you all want to have all of your individual authenticity endorsed by the government. But why does your authenticity have any particular value? You might say this is making you happy, but this is not tied to anything kind of transcendent. And in fact, if we're endorsing every single person's authenticity, then it's kind of like we're giving a participation trophy to everybody. And where's the greatness in that? And so Nietzsche wants to revive this kind of sense of greatness that the pre-modern tradition had, but the pre-modern tradition was very careful to state that true greatness lay only in the realm above us. Nietzsche doesn't have that. And so Nietzsche says the overman is going to establish greatness within himself and do it by dominating over others. And people like Carl Schmitt are going to follow from Nietzsche's postmodernism in this sense that we don't care about other people's liberty at all. We have the power to trample on other people. For Schmitt, it's all about the friend-enemy distinction. There's no sense of responsibility to something higher than us. There's simply conquest over other people's liberty.
Yeah, brilliant. Brilliant. So I'm glad that you brought in Nietzsche, because this is what's stressing me out in some corners of, how should I say it? In some corners of conservatism, you'll see people calling for strength, will, power. We just need someone to take charge and straighten things out and get rid of DEI or whatever it is, whatever policy they're upset with. And part of that I agree with. I say, yeah, that was a really bad idea. We just need to reverse that. So I'm not saying that approach isn't ever conservative, but they almost take that little bit of truth and then they amplify it and say, like you said so well, you said, well, there's really nothing that I'm answerable to except myself. And so then it's all about my will and my power. And then we have the Bronze Age pervert, BAP, and the accelerationists who say we just need to burn all this down. And I think we need a conservatism that can save us. We need an old conservatism that can say, no, we need to not hang on to, we need to acknowledge these inheritances that we have. As Roger Scruton said, being a conservative is about admitting and being honest about the things that we've inherited and trying to order our lives in such a way that they align with those things that we've inherited. So you've mentioned authors covering several thousand years. And if that's what we're trying to ask people to learn or to accept as the only thing that can save us from the Nietzscheans or the late modern liberals, that seems pretty desperate. So where's the hope in this, Professor Geddert?
Yeah, well, so some people would say that conservatism is just kind of about slow change, and so you can't really overthrow anything that's already there. And building off of that, some people would say that conservatism isn't really a rational plan. It's just kind of preserving our habit, preserving our instinct. And this is even Strauss's critique of Burke. I don't think it's an entirely fair critique, but I don't entirely accept this idea that conservatism is simply a disposition or a habit. I think the philosophy of conservatism is that it mediates between the universal and the particular. So, the origins of political philosophy, Plato, he discovers this idea of the universal, that there is something beyond simply our society. There's a universal truth there. Aristotle, his student, builds on this by saying that we can see the universal in the particular. Christianity builds on this by saying that the universal, which is ultimately God, is known through the incarnation, through God become man, and a particular man who walked the earth at a particular time in a particular place, who had friends, who mourned when his friends died. This is why the particular matters. Plato can't quite get there. Plato does so much to inaugurate philosophy, but he can't really make sense of the body, because if it's just our mind that is our connection with the universal, with the eternal, then our bodies are a problem. In Christianity, because the particular matters, this is why our bodies are actually resurrected in the hereafter. And so, the universal, it's not simply a matter of our mind communicating with the one, as Neoplatonists would talk about. It's that we know the universal through the particular. And what does it mean to be particular? I mean, if I go back to Aristotle, what does he say is human nature being a rational and political being? And so to be fully human, this universal category of the human being, the kind of thing that Rousseau wants to deny, we have to live in a political community. And a political community has to be particular. It can't be the whole world. It's our community where we know actual, real people that we have things in common with. And so this, I think, distinguishes conservatism from a liberalism on the one hand, whether it's left liberalism or right liberalism. It's really ultimately a universal system, whatever the content of that, whether it happens to be left or right wing. The particular doesn't really matter. All countries can have the same constitution. And then on the other hand, a kind of Schmittian postmodernism radicalizes particularism. There's no universal truth at all. So everything is simply, friend or enemy. So he looks like he's political because he raises the nation so high, but he chops off that connection to the universal that actually makes the particular political community meaningful. And I think conservatism mediates between the universal and the particular, and it avoids both of those extremes that are so endemic to our time.
Yeah. So brilliant. So oh my goodness. So I've talked about universal and particular many, many times on this, right? And I've never had this answer given yet. And so clearly so. So just to recap again. So one of the pillars of liberalism is universalism. So what's true is true everywhere. Because we love liberal democracy, we can go bomb another country and set up elections because elections are good. They're true everywhere. They're a universal truth. And I've been wrestling with this idea. Well, yeah, there are universal truths, but then there are also particularities. However, the extremes on both sides, one leads to defining a value that we're going to implement around the world, whether it's globalism or democracy. And then on the other side, if we overemphasize the particular, to your point, I love that point, Schmittian postmodernism, everything becomes relative. And it's just a matter of, is it our particularity that we are going to fight against our enemies? So friends versus enemies. It's a very unsatisfying approach. And there you have solved my years long quandary about the universal and the particular. So yeah,
Well,
I owe you one for that.
I'm not going to claim to have the solution like a modern political scientist. I'm just happy to contribute to the conversation.
No, yeah. When the student is ready, the teacher will appear. So I appreciate that. Conservatism is the mediation between the universal and the particular. And yeah, I'm going to be thinking about that for a while. I'll put it on a T-shirt or something and reference you. But the other thought I've had though in this, people writing policy and essays suggesting that we need to get back to focusing on humans and what it means to have a meaningful job and a community that you enjoy, not to live in a shoebox in downtown Toronto. There's an awareness amongst people that something's not right. And so the thinkers and policymakers are coming up with, well, okay, let's talk about more of a humanistic approach. But they still don't want to talk about the metaphysical questions. So it's very much an atheistic or a secular humanism. Atheistic in some cases, but solidly secular. Let's not talk about these bigger questions. So I'm wondering, is there a problem with that? Will that be just as bad as our late stage liberalism if we just go back to a secular humanism?
Yeah, I don't think there's a problem with it per se. I'm all for people talking about more human-centered kind of institutions. For a long time we've only been measuring the economy in terms of GDP, talking about consumption rather than say talking about the nature of work and is this fulfilling in a human life. So I actually welcome that. But I think in the long run, if it doesn't acknowledge its roots, I think it's ultimately going to be limited. Because how are we going to know what human nature really is? How are we going to know what is humanly fulfilling unless, on some level we talk about metaphysics and or theology? This is what people don't want to talk about. Now, you can get good conversation on this when you still have the memory of this lodged in people's psyches, even if they don't claim to be Christians anymore. They still fundamentally believe that, even though they don't really have a reason to believe it. A society can last on fumes for a surprisingly long time, but not forever. And this is being acknowledged even at the highest levels of political philosophy. Take Jürgen Habermas, one of the best known political philosophers of the late 20th century, very much a man of the left, who comes to recognize very late in life, credit to him for his intellectual honesty, that secular philosophy has never come up with a satisfying definition or a satisfying grounding for the kind of equal human dignity that he based his entire career on. He recognized that this was a Christian value. And, to his credit, he started engaging in conversation with people like Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger, the soon to become Pope Benedict. And, I might add that there's a long tradition of Catholic social thought that talks about the nature of work, and it can do this because it has the metaphysical and theological grounding of what a human person is and of why the human person has a dignity. And, in a world where Nietzscheanism is becoming more and more common, I think there has to be a grounding for that kind of dignity, because the latter-day Nietzscheans are going to see through the fact that a society is running on fumes if that's really what it's depending on.
Yeah. When you mention theology, it makes me think of Strauss's comment that there's a theological political problem, or was it theological philosophical? Anyways, he said there's a unbridgeable gap, and he said the only logical response, I'll mess this up, but he said, given that problem, the only logical response of a thinking person is either to become a monk or a philosopher. You can't be both. And it reminded me of a thought that I've had recently about revelation. Revelation is a spooky word, right? As soon as you say theology, oh, you're talking about ideas being beamed into my head or something. And so anyone who's a philosophical naturalist, a materialist, an enlightenment rationalist would say, yeah, that's nonsense. You lost me at that word. But then I was thinking, it doesn't need to be a spooky word. In fact, it's something that is essential to our human situation. If I want to get to know you and what you're experiencing today, you have to open up. I can't measure what you're going through because I sense you're upset or you have a frown on your face. I have to say, how's it going? What's going on with you? So you have to open up. You have to reveal yourself, your fears, your worries, your desires, what's going on with you. A reveal is the verb. Revelation is the noun. It's just the noun form of what happens every day with friends. It's part of our human situation.
Yeah, Sean, I really like how you put that. And that revelation to each other. I mean, this is part of who we are as human beings, because we are relational beings. We're not Robinson Crusoes off on some shipwrecked island, which is kind of the vision that someone like Thomas Hobbes seems to have. That revelation to others means an interaction. It means a back and forth, and it involves constructive criticism. This is what real friendship is. Having someone who can speak into your life, but who can speak into your life in a way that is being done for your good, for your benefit. This is what Aristotle called the friendship of the good. It's because you are in the shared pursuit of the good that you want to help each other along, and that help might require some correction. It's part of the reason why Aristotle says that we are political beings, because we discover who we are, and we learn together by making mistakes, by having other people push against us and realize that they have something to say to us. None of us comes into politics, comes into relationships, comes into self-analysis having all knowledge, having all of the truth. This is why we consider our people on the other side of the aisle the opposition, not the enemy. And this is part of our British inheritance, right? Her Majesty's loyal opposition. Hannah Arendt does a really nice job of speaking to this, of talking about how we can only know ourselves through this disclosure to others. How even our own story is only made together with other people, and that's going to mean other people working together with us, but also pushing against us for our own good, and us doing the same for them. It's not this sort of radical, postmodern, asocial Nietzschean overman, which in some ways is only a kind of radicalization of liberal individualism. Whereas Arendt speaks really nicely to this idea of revelation as self-disclosure. And she makes a lot of the concept of natality, that there's almost something being born there, which is a nice echo in this season of A Birth in Bethlehem.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great connection. So we are recording this before Christmas. It's December 19th, and this will come out in a few weeks. It'll be after Christmas by the time people see this. That's awesome. So we've been going on for an hour or more, and we've had a few technical hiccups, and so this has actually taken more than the usual amount of time. I always have one last question, which is, it's basically one question, but I say it in 3 or 4 ways. I say, what's keeping you awake at night? What have I missed that I should have asked you? Or what do you wish I would have asked you?
Well, I guess I could make some snide remark about over-reliance on technology. I'm sure George Grant would have had something to say about that. But what keeps me up at night? I see a lot of good critical writing today among thoughtful, smart young people who recognize the problems that we're in, and they recognize it in a way that older generations, I think, are really blind to. I think they have a really important voice. But what worries me is that they start to get into this sort of Nietzschean mode of critique. And in their alienation, they try to tear down without seeing that as constructive critique. Taking something down in order to build it up better. I see a lot of just burn it all down. Where's the vision there? And my hope is that these voices will come to see that in fact we have a very strong foundation that we just need to rediscover, that we just need to shore up. We have a wonderful inheritance, and that is what they need to realize, that inheritance is theirs too.
Wow, beautiful way to end. Thank you so much, Jeremy Geddert. Your article, Liberty Without Liberalism, we'll have links for that in the show notes. Written several chapters. You also have a Substack now. It's called Laboratory, so that's awesome that you have a capital T on the Tory, so we'll have links for that. And were you just going to say something else?
I just want to thank you for everything you do with this podcast. You're bringing together a great range of voices, and you're definitely continuing that conversation.
Oh, I appreciate it. Thanks so much, and we'll talk again soon.
It's been wonderful, Sean. Thank you.